Welcome, everyone. I am Michael Moreland. I am the director of the McCullen Center for Law, Religion, and Public Policy here at the Charles Widger School of Law at Villanova University. It's a pleasure to welcome you here to this webinar on educational freedom in the age of COVID. This is a timely topic, to be sure, as families deal with the challenges posed to their children's education by the pandemic. Indeed, there was a piece in the New York Times just 10 days ago about public school parents here in the Philadelphia region running for school board, filing lawsuits, relocating, and moving their children to private school. As policymakers, school boards, and administrators continue to develop new strategies for delivering education amid the pandemic, it is a key moment to consider long-term sustainable improvements to the traditional education system in the United States. We are delighted to welcome three nationally recognized leaders and experts on the topic of education policy. I will introduce our speakers in the order they will present. They will each then provide some opening remarks of around 10 to 12 minutes each, followed by conversation and then questions from you, the audience. So in order again, first, Ashley Rogers Berner is director of the Johns Hopkins Institute for Education Policy and an associate professor at the Johns Hopkins School of Education. She previously served as the deputy director of the Cooney Institute for Education Policy and director of the education program at the Institute for Advanced Studies and Culture at the University of Virginia. Professor Berner has published articles and book chapters on the relationship between educational structure and state funding in democratic nations, religious education and citizenship formation, and teacher preparation in different national contexts, including her 2017 book, Pluralism and American Public Education, No One Way to School. She consults regularly on projects that examine the academic and civic outcomes of different school sectors. Her teaching experience took place in a Jewish preschool, an Episcopal secondary school, and an open university in Louisiana. She serves as a gubernatorial appointee to the Maryland Education Development Consortium, and she holds degrees from Davidson College and a DPhil from Oxford University. Charles Mitchell is the president and CEO of the Commonwealth Foundation here in Pennsylvania. He grew up in the Philadelphia suburbs and is a graduate of Pennsylvania's public schools, Bucknell University, the Koch Associate Program, and the Claremont Institute's Publius Fellowship. Mr. Mitchell joined the staff of the Commonwealth Foundation as Chief Operating Officer in 2010 and became CEO in 2016. In 2014, he received the State Policy Network's Overton Award. In 2017, City and State PA named him one of its 40 under 40 rising stars. And in 2019, he was honored with the Heritage Foundation's Distinguished Alumnus Award. In addition to his Commonwealth Foundation responsibilities, he serves as an elder of his family's church, a founder of Threefold Schoolhouse, Acton Academy, an alumni fellow of the Bucknell Project for American Leadership and Citizenship, and a board member of Americans for Fair Treatment, Broad and Liberty, the Franklin News Foundation, and the Open Discourse Coalition. Nicole Stelle Garnett is the John P. Murphy Foundation Professor of Law at the University of Notre Dame, where her teaching and research focus on education policy and topics related to property law. In addition to dozens of articles on these subjects, she is the author of 2 books, Lost Classroom, Lost Community, Catholic Schools' Importance in Urban America, and Ordering the City, Land Use Policing, and the Restoration of Urban America. Currently, she is engaged in an ambitious research effort in collaboration with scholars from around the world to gain a comprehensive understanding of the legal rules governing and public funds available to faith-based schools in the global South. She's a senior policy advisor for the Alliance for Catholic Education, a program based at Notre Dame engaged in a wide variety of efforts to strengthen and sustain K-12 schools. She's received her BA from Stanford and her JD from Yale Law School. After law school, she clerked for Judge Morris Arnold of the U.S. Court of Appeals for the 8th Circuit and for Associate Justice Clarence Thomas on the Supreme Court of the United States. Before joining the Notre Dame faculty in 1999, she worked for 2 years as a staff attorney at the Institute for Justice, a nonprofit public interest law firm in Washington, D.C. A couple of logistical notes. We will have time for questions at the end, as I mentioned. So please put any questions in the Q&A feature at the bottom of your Zoom screen, and I will curate those questions and pose them to our panelists toward the end of our discussion today. For those that are seeking CLE credit, as you know, there's a form that you have to fill out. And so you can chat or email or whatnot with Victoria Durand, who's here, who is sending out the form right now, I see, that you have to fill out. And as you know, in Pennsylvania, you have to give 2 CLE words, one at the start and one at the end. And so in honor of our first speaker from Johns Hopkins, our first CLE word will be Baltimore. Baltimore is our first CLE word. And so with that, I turn it over to Professor Berner.
Well, thank you so much for having me, Michael. It's a real pleasure to be with you all and to be able to share the panel with Charles and Nicole, who are 2 of my favorite people in this space. So yes, we at the Institute at Johns Hopkins work on policy, and we translate research into policy and practice and vice versa. We are very invested in building tools for the field that reflect international standards of research and best practices. So we exist, Charlie, to serve those of you on the front lines, as I said in our little preamble. So let me just take a moment to pull back from the current political context we're in right now, the fractured political context, and to pull back even from the school choice debates and roll back our cultural expectations for a moment. And I'm going to ask the question, what is public education? Now, 10 to 1, when you ask this question to an American audience, what's public education? We picture the district school. We picture the school that many of us attended as young people, the kind of archetypal all-American common school. But if you ask the question, what's public education in the Netherlands or in many provinces of India or in many provinces of Canada or in Denmark or Sweden or Belgium, and you said, what's public education? You would get a very different answer. Because in these countries, the government funds a wide variety of schools on equal footing and holds them accountable for academic results. That is called educational pluralism. And it simply is a different way to structure public education than we're familiar with in the recent past in our country. So what I want to do with these few moments is just talk about educational pluralism, where it is, what its implications are, why we don't have it, and finally, what are the implications of this difference for our policy debates, and then a brief mention of COVID and the implications for COVID. So the one really stunning fact for an American audience, and in fact, it was stunning to me when I first realized this, is that most democracies, in fact, structure public education very differently. They structure it with a plural system in mind. In other words, the assumption is education cannot be neutral. It's impossible. We can't design a neutral system. And so what we need to do is create communities of meaning around education that reflect what families need and want. So let me give you, and oh, one more thing. At the same time, education is not just an individual good. It is not just a private good. It's a communal good. It's a common good. It builds, when it's done well, it builds citizenship. And it matters to me that your child knows how to read. It matters to you that my child is capable of exercising political judgment. So in that sense, education is unlike many other choices or purchases that we can make. It's a public good, it's a common good. So this both and is built into the pluralistic system. And let me just give you 3 examples. They happen to be 3 of my favorite examples, but I could give dozens. So the first example is the Netherlands. The Netherlands happens to be the most plural educational system in the world. They fund 36 different kinds of schools on equal footing. They fund teacher prep programs that reflect these normative claims. The kinds of schools that they fund are Catholic, all different varieties of Protestant, all different varieties of Jewish schools, Montessori schools, sort of socialist, secular schools, and all students have to take exams that are uniform across the country. They have content-rich assessments that ensure that kids from all these different distinctive communities have a shared conversation. The Netherlands is also one of the only countries, actually the only one to my knowledge, that has educational freedom written into its constitution. And there are a lot of interesting things about the Netherlands, including that it used to be a uniform system. There's a lot of history there about how it moved from uniformity to pluralism. But let me switch to a second example, Alberta. The reason I like this as an example is because Alberta as a province is very similar to what we have found in many states in our country, in that by the 1970s, they had shrunk the number of schools they funded, and they had diminished the academic curriculum and assessments such that only 2 courses were required for high school graduation. And all the analyses show how thin that curriculum was. And then in the 1980s and 90s, the communities within Alberta underwent what I would call a grand bargain. They equalized funding so that school funding was not contingent upon property values, which is the first important point. Number 2, they exploded the types of schools that they fund. They now fund Inuit schooling. They even have a stipend for homeschoolers, for example. And then 3, they required a much more robust curriculum and assessments across the board. Nicole's colleague, Dave Campbell, has studied the outcomes of this system, and they are quite good. Actually, they're among the best in the world on the PISA exams. I just came off of a panel for the Ministry of Education in Alberta, and I had a chance to look at their most current curriculum, and it is still robust. And for COVID, they were able to take this curriculum, and it was immediately online for their families. A shared conversation across differences. The last example I'll give is Australia, which also has some commonalities to our country in that Australia is a provincial system. The provinces, not the federal government, run the educational systems. And some years ago, the federal government began funding tuition at independent schools. Why? Because independent schools happen to have an outsized positive impact on academic outcomes for low-income kids. And so now the central government is the number 1 funder of independent schools in the country. So these are just a few examples of pluralism. I must always say that the combination of choice and accountability does not always work to good. The devil is in the policy details, and I would never say that this model always works for kids. Certainly, it doesn't solve all the problems that we want to solve in a public education system, but it comes much closer to inherently providing excellence and equity than a uniform system can possibly do. Now, why is this? In the research, 2 very simple facts actually come first and foremost from the Catholic school research, dating back decades, that schools that have strong normative cultures and schools that have robust academic curricula can close achievement gaps. So we see this in the research even here, even now, and still all around the world. So the second surprise for an American audience that I want to talk about is that the United States used to have a pluralistic system. It used to be the norm in our country too. When our country, like many modern democracies, started to fund and scale up democratic education, they did 2 things. They expanded access to the liberal arts curriculum, which many high-performing countries still do, and they funded schools through the community schools that existed, whether they were Congregationalist, Catholic, in some places Jewish, or the common school that was vaguely Protestant. And the history of our becoming a uniform system is something that Nicole certainly works on every day with the constitutions that are built that were changed in the late 19th century. And very quickly, what changed to sway the American public from its attachment, its manifest attachment to educational pluralism, to the educational uniformity that we see now. What changed was that Catholic immigrants overwhelmed many of our large cities, and that felt like a threat to the majority culture that was white, Anglo-Saxon, and Protestant. And so there's a lot that we could unpack, but I want to focus on one consequence. Those changes from pluralism to uniformity happened in the late 19th century, and the biggest consequence is our cultural imaginations. So that now we Americans tend to identify public education with the district school. And those of us who are in favor of school choice tend to find ourselves pushing against the norm of uniformity. And the reason why this has really negative consequences for our public discourse is because it pits entire sectors against one another, districts against charters, charters against choice. And this is absent from pluralistic countries. They tend to look at schools individually, not comparing entire sectors. So I was going to touch on COVID in this era, but I think I'm going to stop because I've used up my time. And thank you again for letting me speak. And I look forward to listening to my colleagues.
Thank you, Professor Berner. Mr. Mitchell.
Well, thank you, Michael. I am particularly honored to be alongside three eminent scholars. I have to say, Ashley's exactly right. I'm on the front lines. I guess in some ways this is like three scholars and a warrior walk into a bar. That's just kind of where we are. I'm proud to be a warrior for educational freedom, as you titled the panel, Michael, and just delighted to be here. I have to say, Ashley has been particularly an inspiration to my colleagues and me at the Commonwealth Foundation. She's taught us that really what we're after in fighting for educational freedom is to be more like the Netherlands. So one of my colleagues appeared on Laura Ingram's show last night and said that what we should be in education is more progressive. We should allow the money to follow the child, just like in countries like the Netherlands. And Laura Ingram liked it. So especially given the inspiration that we've taken from Ashley's work, it's a delight for me to be here. And Michael, I could not be a bigger fan of your program or more jealous that such a program does not yet exist at my alma mater, Bucknell. But as you mentioned earlier, I'm working on it. So I just want to say three quick things about what we're here to talk about, which is a perspective from the front lines of education freedom in the age of COVID. Michael mentioned earlier, they did let a Presbyterian elder into this Catholic university thing. So when you let the Presbyterian in, you get three things. So first, this fight, it's hard. Second, in terms of the opportunity that's before us, it's real. And thirdly, at least where I'm sitting, can't speak for my colleagues, but I can speak for my colleague, Michael, it's here. This battle and the opportunity is nowhere more significant than the ground under my feet and under Michael's feet and under the campus of Villanova University, which is right here in Pennsylvania. So first of all, I just want to be really direct up front. We're talking about education freedom in the age of COVID. I do believe that we have a tremendous opportunity right now around this issue about which we all care so deeply, but it would be, I think, just wrong not to acknowledge right at the outset that this is a terribly difficult cultural moment. And in fact, I revealed this to Michael earlier. My wife has COVID right now. So I'm not making light of what our global situation is in making the point that we do have a tremendous opportunity right now to help children. We have to acknowledge the difficulty of this moment. I think we also owe it to ourselves to do something to help as many children as possible. And secondly, in terms of it being hard, I'm a realist. I realize the fight that we're in is very difficult. I realize that what kids right here in Pennsylvania, for example, are up against is very difficult. And I'll give you an example. My grandfather was the original Charles Mitchell. I'm the third. So I grew up hearing about how his education at South Philadelphia High School was all he needed in life. He used to talk, he never went to college, and he sort of had a chip on his shoulder about it. So he would talk about how I didn't need to go to college. I went to South Philadelphia High School, and all these kids going to college today would wish they got an education like I got at South Philadelphia High School. Well, I looked up earlier today in preparation for our time together, the math proficiency at South Philadelphia High School today, and it's in the single digits. Those children are not getting anything close to the opportunity that my grandfather got. And I care deeply about that. And that's why, by the way, for those of you who may know more about Johns Hopkins or Villanova or Notre Dame than the Commonwealth Foundation, that's why this is our most important issue. It's the thing that we all care the most deeply about. We work on a lot of issues, but none is more important than giving every child, whether it's at South Philadelphia High School or in Scranton or Erie or Harrisburg or Pittsburgh or wherever, the same opportunity that my grandfather had, that a lot of us have had. It needs to be excellence in education for all, which is a term I'll come back to in a minute. So first of all, this battle's hard. Second of all, I think it's important to acknowledge the opportunity before us is real. And just like I've lived the difficulty of this through my grandfather, I'm living the reality of the opportunity for education freedom, in some part through my children. Michael mentioned earlier, my wife and I, we didn't know COVID was coming, but in the middle of COVID, we decided to start a school. And we are actually the proprietors of a non-traditional education studio in our area of Pennsylvania. And if you are wondering whether there truly is a huge demand out there on the part of families for educational excellence, there is. Our enrollment increased by 50% during COVID, despite the fact that this is a much more difficult time for a lot of families to pay tuition. And we expect that we will basically triple in 2 years. And I hear that from school owners and founders all across the state and all across the country, that there's a tremendous demand out there. But of course, Michael would not have convened us for this discussion today if there were not some public policy issues that were related to that, and especially around the fact that many people do not have the means to access excellent education, particularly, but not limited to, in our urban areas. But even when I think about that, I'm still convinced that this opportunity is real, because I got to tell you, my colleagues and I have never seen so many legislators line up at our door asking, what do I do? I see this in my district. I have people pounding on me. What do I do? I need to do something to expand education freedom. You know what the good news is? We have answers. On this panel, we have answers. At the Commonwealth Foundation, we have answers. And that's why I really do believe, thirdly, that the opportunity to greatly expand education freedom in the age of COVID is here, and literally here under my feet. And I'll show that to you really two ways. First of all, Pennsylvania is a challenging state. It is not easy to get any public policy done in Pennsylvania. We can argue about who to name a bridge after, and we have. I can tell you about that in the Q&A if you really want to know. But on this big, hairy, tough issue, despite having divided government, we have achieved over the last 6 years some of the largest increases in education freedom in America, despite having a governor who ran for office saying he was just against almost everything that Ashley or I have said so far, and having the usual. I mean, do I need to say more about the political environment in our country over the last few years? I mean, it's been horrible. And yet, if you look at just the program that we currently have in Pennsylvania, that allows people to redirect their tax dollars to make scholarships for kids, we've seen some of the biggest increases in America. That's great. However, there's still a waiting list for those scholarships, and there are many, 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 many families that are not being served. So while I know from the past that we can expand education freedom, I feel we need to do much more. And that's what brings me to the term I introduced earlier. I know our term here today is education freedom. I love Ashley's term in terms of educational pluralism, but there's a new piece of legislation in Pennsylvania that I would submit everyone here should take note of, called the Excellence in Education for All Act. This was just introduced in both chambers of our legislature. And it's basically, if I may say, everything we would all dream of in terms of education freedom. First of all, it would eliminate the waiting list for our current school choice program by significantly expanding that, and then also doing what other states such as Florida have done, putting an automatic escalator so that the program grows with demand. If all of the credits, the tax credits are taken, then the program grows automatically, which is kind of like a reasonable way to do business, isn't it? I mean, it's a little bit insane if you think about it. Not only do we have children and their families lining up to receive scholarships, we have businesses lining up to give money. And we just don't have enough places for them to give money. Well, we can fix that, but we have to do much more than that. And another provision of the bill would be to create education opportunity accounts, which would basically mean, in plain language, every kid who qualified would show up at a school with $6,500 in his backpack or her backpack for tuition. You think about, I mean, I think about this two ways. I think about this as a practitioner of public policy or a fighter or a warrior, as we said earlier. I also think about it as the proprietor of a schoolhouse. It would change the game for me and my wife as we think about our little education studio. If we knew there was that type of public policy out there, that a family could come to our door with $6,500 that they could use to get in, it would totally change the marketplace. It would totally stimulate not just us to expand, but lots of people to do what we've done, take that plunge, or existing schools to expand. It would be incredible. And it's been done in other states. It's time for it to happen in Pennsylvania. And we have a big change coming here. We have a gubernatorial election next year. Our governor is term limited, so we know we're going to have a new governor. We have a legislature that has dramatically embraced these principles over the last few years, as shown by the progress we've made and by this new legislation. Again, I'm a realist. I told you a few minutes ago, I confess, like, it's hard. The COVID moment is hard. The fight for educational freedom is hard. I understand that. But that doesn't change the fact that we have a real opportunity, and that our viewers around the country, if you're thinking about where you might want to pay attention to, where you might see some progress on behalf of kids who deserve the same opportunity that people like my grandfather had, or people like those of us who care so deeply about education had, the place you should be watching is the home of Villanova University, in my humble opinion, the greatest and most important state in America, the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. Thanks so much, Michael, for the opportunity to share.
Thank you, Mr. Mitchell. Professor Garnett.
Thank you, Michael, and thank you for inviting me to come and have this conversation, which is such an important one. I'm so glad to be a part of this panel. Like Charles, I've been very influenced by Ashley's work. In fact, it's inspired an entire new world of comparative law for me. But I really loved the idea of thinking about this topic in terms of pluralism, and in particular, thinking about pluralism in the United States and why it's important. So I thought I would do a couple things, and then first of all, I just want to give you a little snapshot of the state of play for parental choice in the United States. And then I'm going to talk about a very important Supreme Court decision that just was decided this last June, and then talk about some possible implications of that decision. So sorry, I have a very loud college-age daughter who's here for dinner. I'm going to share my screen just to show two quick images. I hope that's okay. Okay, wait. If I do it that way, though, then you're going to, okay, that's what we want to do. So the first is the state of play for parental choice in the United States. So one thing that's actually been quite hopeful in the last, so I was involved in the parental choice movement in its infancy. The first program is enacted in 1990 by the Wisconsin legislature, which allowed 500 kids to go to secular schools in Milwaukee. I was an attorney at the Institute for Justice, which is a nonprofit law firm. In 1995, soon after I graduated from law school, Wisconsin expanded that program to include religious schools, and Ohio followed suit. And I was involved in the original kind of the challenges to including religious schools in private school choice programs in the United States, first in the Milwaukee program and then in the Cleveland program. So in 2002, the Supreme Court held that it was not unconstitutional. It didn't violate the First Amendment Establishment Clause to include religious schools in private school choice programs, because the beneficiaries of the funds were the children and their families and not the schools. And since that time, private school choice, the good news is that private school choice has actually expanded dramatically. So I talk to bishops about private school choice, and I'm always sort of Catholic bishops. I'm always surprised how little they know about this. So currently, this is a map of the United States. This is a little infographic that I hope everyone can see that is from the American Federation for Children that talks about the state of play. So currently 26 states, Puerto Rico and Washington, D.C. have private school choice programs. These fall into basically two buckets. One is like the Pennsylvania program that Charles mentioned, which is the tax credit scholarship program, which incentivizes donations to private school choice through saying if I could get a tax credit for giving a donation to a private school choice program in Pennsylvania. The largest school choice programs in the United States are tax credit scholarship programs, including Pennsylvania's. The largest altogether is Florida's tax credit scholarship program. There are also voucher programs that are basically scholarships. So there are 25 voucher programs in the United States, including in my state of Indiana, which functions just as a public scholarship. So my children go to St. Joseph's School, and about a third of the kids in the school get a voucher. They income qualify, it's means tested. The state of Indiana sends a check to St. Joe Grade School for, I can't remember what the amount is now, $6,500, which basically covers tuition. So this is really good news that over half of the states have private school choice programs in the United States. Over 43 states, maybe up to 44 now, have charter schools. The map here shows, if you can see, the light blue is where there are charter school laws, but no private school choice. And the dark blue is where there are both private school choice and charter schools. So charter schools, as you probably know, are privately operated, but publicly funded schools. They're designated they're designated to be public schools by every state, and every state requires them to be secular. So that's just a little like snapshot of what private school choice looks like and what school choice looks like in the United States. One little aside, charter schools on average get about 80% of the money that public schools, district schools get. And private school choice depends on the state, much, much less than that. So maybe 40%. So the private school choice funds that are provided are important, but they're little. Just to give you a little, even though this is a happy picture, I'm just going to give you a little so there are currently, says this little infographic says $2.9 billion expended on school choice programs in the United States in 2019, 2000. That's 0.3% of the total funding on K-12 education in the United States. So it looks like a happy picture, but it's like a little bit. About 1% of students benefit from one of these programs. About 10% of American school children attend private schools, and 1% of the total kids, K-12 kids, get some funds from a private school choice program in the United States. So this is not a pluralistic system by any stretch of the imagination. It's a hopeful picture. The trajectory is good, but 0.3% of funding is nothing. And 1% is almost nothing. About 10% of private school kids now get some funding through a private school choice program. That's good, but it's not enough. Okay, so that's the picture. I also then want to just mention a Supreme Court case and talk about its implications. So in June, the Supreme Court of the United States had handed down a 5-4 decision. It was called Espinosa versus Montana. And it's an incredibly important decision. So what had happened, it's a very complicated procedural background, but let's just shorten it in this way. Montana had adopted a private school choice program. It was like a little bitty, it was a $500 tax credit. And the Supreme Court of Montana had invalidated that program because it included religious schools. The reason that they said that program was illegal in the state of Montana was because the Supreme Court of Montana said, our Constitution has a provision, often called a Blaine Amendment, I have another little picture in a second, that prohibits the funding of religious schools, sectarian schools. And so 37 states have such a provision. It's called a Blaine Amendment because the person that it's named after, Senator Blaine, was a man in the 19th century who attempted to, as a Speaker of the House, attempted to get the federal Constitution amended to prohibit the funding of sectarian schools. Senator Blaine was not a fan of the Catholic Church. Sectarian at the time meant Catholicism, and the entire purpose of this amendment was to keep funds out of Catholic schools. And it's captured beautifully in this very famous cartoon, which I have hanging on my wall in my office. And if you look very carefully, you will see that these vicious crocodile type figures are coming to devour this very saintly and holy and very brave public school teacher protected by the Holy Bible. And if you look very carefully at the crocodiles, you will see that these are bishops, and this is a mitre, the teeth, and they're coming to devour these children and this public school teacher. This poor public school lady is being dragged off to the gallows by the Irish mob, and you can't really see it, but in the background, it says the political Roman Catholic school. So these provisions of these anti-Catholic provisions were enshrined in 37 state constitutions. And Espinosa says you cannot, as a state, rely on your state constitutional Blaine Amendment, this provision, this establishment provision, to exclude religious schools from private school choice programs. The Supreme Court very carefully says, and it's not because they're anti-Catholic, it's just the court says, look, if you have a private school choice program and you say to parents, you can go wherever you want, unless it's religious, that's a violation of the free exercise clause. That is religious discrimination. So why does that matter? And I'll stop the sharing now so everyone doesn't have to stare at the Thomas Nast cartoon. So why does that matter? Well, first of all, it defangs the Blaine Amendments, which are often used in when a new state passes a provision, a private school choice program. Often the first thing that now that the Supreme Court's doors are closed, the first thing that the opponents do is run to the state courts and try to get that invalidated on the Blaine Amendment grounds, because it basically says you cannot rely on your state constitution to discriminate against religious schools. That's important. It's actually very important. 37 states have these things, so it's a big win. And then the second reason, and I just will mention this quite briefly, I want to be cognizant of time, is that remember that I said that charter schools must be secular. And in his dissent in this Espinosa case, Justice Breyer, who's dissenting, he thinks it's fine to discriminate against religious schools, says, well, what about charter schools? Are charter schools public schools or are they private schools? Because Justice Breyer says in his dissent, because if they're private schools, you crazy people just said that that you have to let them be religious. And so I have an article that says, yeah, you're right. That's a pretty good argument, Justice Breyer. And so Espinosa has a lot of implications, but one of the biggest ones, and I want to be aware that people want to have questions, is this question about whether charter school laws, if a state doesn't have to adopt a charter school law, but if a charter school law is a program of private school choice, Espinosa actually suggests that they must allow schools to be religious, charter schools. That would be a game changer. Currently, if a Catholic school or a Presbyterian school wants to get charter school funds, they must secularize. That's the deal the state makes. We'll give you the money, but you may not be religious. Give up your principles and you can have the cash. And that puts religious schools, I think, in an unjust and unfair position. There will be litigation soon. I have reason to believe there may even be litigation in Pennsylvania, although I have no inside information. I have been told that there's people talking about it. There will be litigation soon to challenge charter school laws, exclusion or prohibition on religious charter schools. It's a very complex question. I mean, there are sort of two big questions. The first is, should we consider charter schools public schools or private schools for constitutional purposes? In constitutional law terms, we would ask, should they be considered state actors, which means, are they controlled by the government? Are they government actors? They're called public schools in every state law, but what Ashley says is really relevant to this question. In many cultures, public school doesn't mean government school. So are they private? And if they are private, then they can be religious. That's clear. The next question is, if they are private, must the state permit them to be? I don't know. I think in 5 years, we will know. This will go to the Supreme Court. There will be cases filed. And why would it matter to religious schools? I mean, I think, first of all, that there are a lot more resources available to charter schools. They're available in a lot more states. And so this would be a really attractive option for many for many religious schools. What should we think as advocates for private school choice in the United States about this? I'm not sure. Charter schools are also more heavily regulated than private schools. There are more accountability rules. They may enjoy less if they became religious. They might not have the same religious freedom rights as private schools participating in private school choice. So I think it's a really complicated but game-changing question. Because if charter schools can be religious, or maybe perhaps must be religious, then we expand access to private school choice from this little bitty pot of funds to a very large pot of funds. 6% of American public school children are enrolled in charter schools, but the number is much higher in many urban areas, upwards of 50% in a number of urban areas. So it's sort of a game-changing question that this Espinosa case raises. So.
Great. Thank you, Professor Garnett. So as I mentioned, we have time for questions and answers. I'll pose a few questions, but in the meantime, if you have any, you can put them in the Q&A feature at the bottom of your Zoom page here. Because one overarching question, and anyone can take a bite at this if you want. You know, we talk about political divisiveness and the toxic political climate we have, and it does strike me this is an issue that it seems to be sort of a red-blue issue, but strikes me it isn't necessarily. I mean, you look at Nicole's map, a state like Illinois has a couple years ago enacted a fairly robust school choice program. But a state like Texas, my understanding is Texas has been a very hard state for advocates of school choice over the last several years. So if anyone wants to just kind of opine on sort of, you know, why that is and kind of what the headwinds and crosswinds are in an issue like this, it'd be I think that'd be interesting.
So I guess
I'm happy to. Oh, you go ahead.
Ashley, I can start by saying I think one of the reasons why you see more blue states or divided states enacting private school choice has been the messaging has shifted from sort of talk of markets to talk of justice. And it's really become more about a question of educational access for kids that are being ill-served. And so you have more African-American legislators from urban areas, for example, saying, yeah, like this is about us, it's about our kids. I think that's a big reason. It's still more likely that a state with a Republican legislature and a Republican governor will enact a program, but increasing numbers of divided or even all blue states are doing this. And I think this will become a bigger issue after COVID, because a lot of the kids that are being there's a lot of disadvantaged kids are not being well served right now, and their parents understand that. So I think that's a really important point, is sort of what is the message? If the message about pluralism and access, it's different than if it's about sort of, and I like Milton Friedman. I'm kind of a libertarian, as Michael knows, but I think that it's an important social justice issue.
I would concur with that. And I would also say that what seems to be working in some of the blue states is the capacity to not, as Nicole said, not lead with the kind of individualistic goal, but to actually enter into some kind of grand bargain where nobody's fully happy and yet people get what they need. So the legislation that went through in Illinois had the state's first tax credit program, which was extensive. It also had the requirement that the students take public exams, which was also like seen as an important quality measure. And they also provided substantial funding increases for district schools. So when you read the commentary afterwards, nobody was like jubilant. Nobody got everything they wanted, but it was the art of compromise, political compromise. And that's where we really need to reward those politicians who are willing to engage in that kind of courageous negotiation.
I agree with all that. And Michael, if I could just add one thing, we've seen this debate become much more partisan, especially at the national level over the last few years. And to anybody who's listening, whether you're in Pennsylvania or not, I think that just adds to the importance of having these discussions and advocating for education freedom in your state, in your local community, because it is in those more localized context that you can transcend these partisan barriers. And in fact, we've seen that in Pennsylvania, and as Ashley said, in other states. It is not, we're not immune to the national bitterness and partisanship, but it is at least easier to bridge it at a more local level.
Great. Well, we have some great questions. I will mention the second CLE word now, which will be Wildcats with the NCAA tournament around the corner here. The second CLE word is Wildcats. Someone asked about the bill that Charles mentioned, and Charles answered that question in the chat. Someone asked, can someone comment on how the U.S. history of racial segregation schools has influenced our current policies?
Well, I think it's a complicated question. So often in these debates about parental choice, people will point to the very troubling history of the white academies in the South after segregation was dismantled by the Supreme Court, and say, people would try to use school choice to get around these things, these questions of to get around integration. I don't think that's the story of parental choice today. In fact, I think the story is the opposite. I think it's possible that racism and white flight and other disinvestment in our urban areas led to some very bad educational outcomes for people of color in our urban areas. And that one of the history, so that's one history. So the parents want options. They didn't have options. They want options. They continue to want options. A majority of children who attend charter schools and a majority of children who participate in private school choice programs are children of minority children, children of color, disadvantaged children. Almost all private school choice programs are means tested. So there's that option. The other thing is, I think that if you look at, as there was disinvestment in urban areas, white flight and other demographic trends, the Catholic Church in some places, particularly Lutherans, remained. And before charter schools, those faith-based schools really were the best educational options for children of color. And that really was the original argument in favor of sort of the social justice argument in favor of private school choice, is opening up the doors of good schools to children who are not being served well. I think that continues to be an important part of the rhetoric, the debate, and the reality of school choice.
I'll just give two examples to what Nicole said, and I agree with everything that she said. The one thing is what can happen in places like Minneapolis, St. Paul, where there's a charter school litigation right now, and you have this weird situation where there are, largely majoritarian groups, including teacher unions and so forth, arguing that this is, inequitable and arguing against the existence of charters and funding and so forth. And then you have the civil rights community, which is saying, wait a minute, we've designed charter schools that are culturally affirming. They are outperforming, and they are for our kids, and they reflect the norms that we want for our children. And I would just simply look at that and say, what's the argument here? How can you, so there's that piece. The other thing I want to say that is not so obvious always is that there is a lot of internal segregation that goes on in our schools. And this is very true in many large public high schools, where our school culture survey that we have now nationally, we see some real racial disparities in access to challenging coursework, for example. And so even if you look at a school's demographics on the outside and you say, well, this is clearly an integrated school, you really have to be careful about giving all kids in all contexts equal access to challenging coursework that we know makes a huge difference in social mobility and all this. I would just call attention to what Chicago Public Schools did with the International Diploma Program. When they put the IB diploma program in some of their lowest performing public high schools, the kids who participated had a 40% greater chance of attending college and a 50% greater chance of attending selective colleges, persistence in college. This makes a difference. And Rahm Emanuel made the IB program a signature of his innovations as mayor. And so I guess I would say, pulling back even from the school choice debates, putting rigorous material in front of kids is a good thing in every school, and every school can do it. And that's a racial equity issue.
I would add to that the studies, particularly Patrick Wolf at the University of Arkansas, the School Choice Demonstration Project, has shown that school choice tends to be in the private school choice. There's debates about charter schools, which I'll leave to the side about whether they are pro-integration, but private school choice is very pro-integration. It leads to more integration. And he also has studies suggesting that it's more integrated within the schools, and that kids are more likely to take rigorous classes in private schools, despite whatever their demographics. So those things I think are all pro reasons for those of us who care deeply about educational equity and integration. Those are all reasons to support private school choice.
So here's a question. As school board candidates in the Philly suburbs, how can we promote the idea of pluralism in our campaigns and then hopefully on our own boards? It would appear some of the resistance could be related to the public school system, fearing competition. Yeah, basically, how would you encourage people who are engaged in this, either informally or running for boards or things like that, to kind of advocate for pluralism along the lines that we've been talking about?
Yeah, so let me jump on that one, Michael. First of all, obviously, we're not going to give any political advice on a university call, especially when I'm here with at least two lawyers. But I would say two things for somebody who wants to advance these things at the local level. Number one, talk like Ashley. Talk about how we can be more progressive in education. Talk about how all of these approaches can help more children, as opposed to some of the rhetoric that's been used in the past that just isn't helpful. I like Milton Friedman too, but doesn't work. Secondly, and I'm happy to work with the questioner, in my capacity at Commonwealth subsequent to this call, and it's easy to find us if you want us. But if you are a school board member in Pennsylvania, you can do something about educational pluralism, not just campaigning on it. You can actually do it. There is under current law, a school board in Pennsylvania could make funds available for a student to attend the school of his or her choice. That's not there's no policy change that has to happen. It's current law. You just need a school board that's willing to do it. So I would encourage and challenge anybody who's looking at serving on a school board or who lives next door to a school board member or whatever. You guys can literally take this into your own hands. And just to put a finer point on it, one of the things I've really taken away from Ashley's work that I would encourage in this whole thing is what some of my colleagues call a generous tone towards public schools or government schools or whatever you want to call it. This is not about advantaging one sector at the expense of another. Really what this is about is your money following your child to the educational environment that works for him or her. And that may be your local district school, that may be a Catholic school, maybe whatever. But that's something that you can do as a school board member in Pennsylvania today.
So there's a challenging question. We're coming up on the end of our time, but someone asked, isn't it difficult to contemplate emulating the Netherlands? And we could take maybe the Netherlands as just one example, when it is a mostly homogenous society with 17 million citizens and minimal poverty. How would their system even begin to be implemented in the US? So I guess, Ashley, you'd be the...
I'm happy to take that. It's a really good question. And I would say that many of these countries are about the size of a state in our country. I would also push back a little bit on the assumption that these are homogeneous populations. In many of the large cities in Europe, there is actually a higher rate of immigration than we have in this country. And certainly places like Alberta, there's a higher rate of immigration. They're actually dealing with immigration on a large scale for their size, and it has had all kinds of consequences in policy. And I don't think we have time to go into it, but I think the reality is that what Charles is saying, and what certainly all of us have experienced, is that it is possible. It is happening. And in some states, my state of Maryland, you would think, I mean, there's a teeny tiny school choice program. Charters are not even real charters by the general term that we understand it. But places like Florida, where they have ample choice, where the districts are starting to differentiate between their schools because they realize that distinctive cultures matters. San Antonio and Miami-Dade are two examples I would point to where the district schools are part of the solution. This is not a battleground any law. I mean, there are, of course, law. I don't mean to pretend like it's easy in a state like Florida, because it isn't. But it's working, and it can work, and we can make it even, there are policy changes that we can make in almost every state to make it better, but we're moving in the right direction.
Well, we are up against the end of our time. I want to thank our panelists very much for their thoughtful contributions and answering some tough questions in our Q&A here. So thank you, Ashley, Charles, and Nicole. Thanks also to Melanie Dudley, the Assistant Director of the McCullen Center, to Nicole Garofano, our events coordinator, to Carla Edwards and Victoria Durand in our faculty support office, Samantha Lair in communications, and Brian Sirak and Alvin Wong in unit for handling a lot of the IT infrastructure in the background. Thanks to all of you for your participation and joining us. And I'm sorry we didn't get to all the questions. There are many good questions in the Q&A, but hopefully this is the beginning of several other opportunities in which we'll have to engage with some of these issues. So thanks again to all of you. And with that, we are adjourned.